everybody. Thanks so much for coming. My name's Anne. I'm from Verso Books. Thanks so much for being here. So tonight we are very honored to have Sven-Eric Liedman joined in conversation with Adam Tooze and Clara. I don't know how to say your last name correctly. Mattei. We have copies of Sven-Eric's new biography, A World to Win, for 50% off over there, along with a few other books on Marx. So I'll do a brief introduction of our speakers, and then I'll turn it over to Sven-Eric, who will do a brief reading, and then Clara and Adam will have a discussion, and then we'll take some questions from you guys. So Sven-Eric Liedman is a professor emeritus of the history of ideas at the University of Gothenburg. He's been reading and writing about Karl Marx for over 50 years, and he's the author of the new biography, A World to Win, The Life and Works of Karl Marx. Adam Tooze holds the Shelby Cullom Davis Chair of History at Columbia University and serves as director of the European Institute. He is currently at work on a history of the global financial crisis from 2008 to 2018, which will appear in time for the anniversary in September 2018. He has written and reviewed for the Financial Times, The Guardian, the LRB, the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the New York Review of Books, The Nation, and others. And Clara Mattei is assistant professor of economics at the New School for Social Research. So I'll turn it over to Sven-Eric to get us started. And at the end, I'll pass around this mic and we can take some questions. We are live streaming this right now, but I'm going to turn off the live stream for the Q&A. Thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's great to be here in this room, seeing all of you here. I've written this thick biography on Marx, and when you have just such a book behind you, you must have at least some reasons why you have done it. So I think I have two main reasons to write it and to do it just now. First, a quarter century after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the dissolution of the Soviet Union, it has finally become possible to provide a portrait of Marx unobscured by what happened after his death. Quite simply, we have an opportunity to assess the whole of Marx's multifaceted work in a way that would have been impossible only a few years ago. The second reason is a little more down to earth. The major critical edition of the Marx-Engels Gesamtausgabe has now come so far that the greater part of his work, including important previously unpublished manuscripts and excerpts, has been edited in an exemplary manner. It is now possible, for example, to compare Engels's editing of the third volume of Capital with Marx's own manuscript. I'll just say a few words about the difference between my biography and other recent Marx biographies. You have the American Jonathan Sperber and the English Gareth Stedman Jones, also the French Jacques Attali, or the Italian Stefano Petrucciani. More than them, I am concerned with the last few decades of intensive research concerning the Grundrisse, and in particular Capital. It is striking how names such as Hans-Georg Backhaus, Michael Heinrich, and Andrew Kleeman are conspicuous by their absence in the other biographies. As a result, they don't succeed in providing an up-to-date reading of Capital. I've tried to give you both the life and the works of Karl Marx with some stress on the works. It's not to me, but to you to judge how well I have succeeded. I just read a few paragraphs at the end of the book, the final paragraphs, the real conclusion of it. Just a few paragraphs. On the other side of the fall of the Soviet Union and China's development into the most expansive capitalist economy of the 21st century, the term Marxism itself has lost its topicality. It's no longer a norm to follow or oppose for those who want a way out of the world that has taken shape over the last 2 decades. So far, the opponents of this new capitalism have assembled under the slogan, "Another world is possible." Many different tendencies can gather under this banner: Marxists, Leninists, and anarchists, Maoists and feminists, radical Christians and radical Muslims, environmental activists and anti-militarists. But one name continually turns up in this new age: Karl Marx. It's no longer Marx, the supposed system builder, who attracts people. It is instead the Marx who constantly sought to push deeper into the labyrinths of the age he lived in. The Marx who was never content with the magnificent discoveries he made, but who saw new horizons opening over the top of every hill and therefore had to continue on his way. This Marx is subtle enough to form the basis for precise, philosophically demanding analysis. But Marx is also resolute and direct enough to still inspire topical criticism of capitalism's latest achievements, the failings of politics, and the genuflection of the contemporary world of ideas before a fetish like the market. In both cases, it's Marx of the 19th century, not the 20th, who can attract the people of the 21st. Today, the world is globalized in much of the same way as it was before 1914. Communications move much more quickly, but this is a degree of difference and not of type. People, messages, and ideas are flung around the globe. Money circulates between continents in a never-ceasing stream. Poverty lives side by side with wealth, and capital exercises its impersonal power over all and sundry. In this world, Karl Marx lives on. His path in our present era and our future is not a subject for this book. Here it's Marx of the 19th century that has been in focus. We have followed the winding path through his life and his writings. What is the image of him that ultimately emerges? For me, it's without a doubt Faust, the restless doctor in his dark study, who is constantly seeking to increase his knowledge of the world. Marx certainly struck no deal with the devil. In his eyes, this potentate is as much an ingredient as God is in the opium of the people called religion. No, Marx allied himself with the working class. He wanted to work for the liberation of the workers. In their liberation, he saw the liberation of all humanity. He has no unequivocal answer to the question of the path to such liberation, the ballot box, bloody uprisings, or a combination of both. But it is not with his answers that he maintains his contemporaneity. He lives on as the great critic of capitalism. As a critic, he sometimes lets us imagine a positive, contrasting picture of human activity, in which solidarity can coexist with freedom and pleasure with seriousness. It's a possible utopia for our time as well. Yeah.
Thank you, Sven-Eric. It's a real pleasure to be here to comment on your book, which I've had the privilege of reading early and with great pleasure. Thanks are due both to you for having poured out a lifetime of research into this monumental volume for us. You were saying over drinks beforehand that you were in the field for the 150th anniversary of Marx's birth, which is, and you said so with pleasure. So that's a wonderful thing to hear. Thanks are also absolutely due to Verso, not just for hosting this evening, but for so rapidly translating this book and for rendering it in an English which is really a pleasure to read. It's long, But you get into it and it carries you along, and there's a voice in the translation which isn't always true. I don't know whether it's quite yours because I don't speak Swedish.
I hope so.
But
I hope so.
It's a distinctive voice that carries one along. And as you were saying, and I think you were being polite, this book fills, I think, a really essential gap for readers of our kind, the kind of people who are here this evening, who basically agree with you that this is not a closed case, that this is something that should be of immediate concern to us. The two English language biographies that you referred to seem to me to be not just different from yours in their failure to be up to date with the new reading of Marx, but also just fundamentally different in the way that they're set up. I mean, Jonathan Sperber shows no trace of ever having any fundamental personal commitment to Marxism. He's a 19th century historian who gives us an amazing picture of a 19th century contemporary. Gareth Stedman-Jones is a more classically post-Marxist text. This is somebody who was once an Althusserian Marxist who lost the faith and is writing a book out of that disappointment and essentially trying to come to terms with failure, which is such a familiar way of narrating the Marx story and has its aficionados and those who follow that kind of line, but it takes you to only one particular place. And what I think is so important about your book, for us in the extended sense of the kind of the Verso family of readers, is that you don't start from there. You start from the premise that this is a live project and one that needs urgently to concern us. And I know that both Clara and I want to really discuss the basis of that urgency and what that actuality actually consists of. But one of the questions I wanted to start with before we go to that kind of the big question, one of the questions I wanted to start with was actually about the project of writing a biography as such. I mean, you're an intellectual historian who's previously worked in a more thematic kind of way. Here you set yourself to reconstructing, and that's one of the things that makes the book so readable. It's a story. It unfolds like a family drama. It carries you along. But that's almost a methodological choice to organize it this way as a coherent life. And I would love to hear you reflect on the experience of encountering this man, and not just this man, of course, but his friendship circle, his family, the love of his life, Jenny Westphal, and specifically, I guess, the question of what, for somebody committed to, or at least inspired by a Marxism or Marx, what the project of biography is. What is a Marxist biography of Marx? What does that consist of? Is this a Marxist biography of Marx?
Of course, it's always a problem to write in a Marxist way a biography on like this. I think I tried here just in a chapter to find out Marx's position in history, what was going on just before his life and during his lifetime, economically, socially, technologically. It's very important to Marx, when Marx was 7 years old, the train.
Yes.
Was
Jenny called him my little train boy? Or?
Yeah, something like that. Yeah, exactly.
He was a railway nut as a teenager.
He was
born 1818, first train's 1830, right? So he's 12 when the train's come along.
25, it was the Stephenson's train, the locomotive from Manchester to Liverpool, but then the traffic. The real traffic started in 1830. Yeah. So Marx, he could follow it. And you have the telegraph, too. It's also very important, I think. And he lived through this history very, very, very closely. To him, productive forces, they are very, very central. One of his great interests in his Middle Ages was chemistry. You know, chemistry was a very, very important science. You know, it has amazing practical results in the 1860s, 70s, 80s. And he was also a rather close friend of Karl Marx, a very prominent chemist.
This is in soil chemistry and agronomy.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. So yes, that was a deviation. But I mean, to put Marx into that context, it's very important. Not only because it was one of his great interests, but also because it shaped the time very much. But then, of course, also the social changes, industrialism. We are so often talking about Marx's concept of revolution, but it's interesting, the Industrial Revolution is so very central to him. And this revolution, it exploded in his early years. Of course, at first in Britain, but then also here in the States and in Germany, France, and so on. That's a very important background, not only for his interest, but for whatever happened in those days. And then, of course, the great ideas is also the background. Hegel is always important. Hegel's philosophy is always important for him. So I tried to put his life into a context that is rather close to, let's say, a materialist interpretation of history.
I thought the other way that you were doing it was that almost, you know, thinking about this, I was wondering whether a Marxist biography had essentially to be a feminist biography, in that a Marxist biography would be attentive to the labor of reproduction as well as production. And in this book, you do, I think, very successfully struggle with this question of Marx and the woman question, quote unquote, his relationship to Jenny and the material circumstances of their domestic life as an absolutely crucial element.
Absolutely.
Because what is it that we mean, after all, with the biographical but the personal, and how that becomes political?
Oh yes, I've tried to stress very much the importance of Jenny for Marx. He didn't say so much about it himself. You know, he was a typical man of the German man of the 19th century. Engels was much more advanced in here than Karl Marx was. But I think it's very important to have this aspect there. And then it's interesting, his youngest daughter, Eleanor Marx, she became very, very influential for a very short period. But I mean, Karl Marx, he said often about Eleanor Marx that she's me. that she was some kind of another Karl Marx. And I can only say it's a tragedy that her life became so short. Yes. She was one of the most promising people there. But I mean, there you have also the feminist question here. For her, it was very, very important. You know, immediately after her, we have Clara and then Rosa Luxemburg and so on. Those very, very important women. The women are also behind the International Women's Day.
Yeah. And death does, I mean, you're talking about Eleanor's short life, and death hangs over this entire, I mean, there's another materiality there, isn't it? In the sense of just the presence in his family at home with tuberculosis as the curse of the Marxes.
Oh, yeah.
And then 4 of his 8 children, or of their 8 children dying before reaching maturity. I mean, there's an incredibly, reading that and then thinking about the passages in Capital about the destruction of the bodies of the working class. For me, it took on a much more immediate force after reading your biography than it ever had before.
Exactly, exactly.
I mean, those just impressions of the young, of his son who made it to 8 or 9.
Eight years. Yes,
in his arms.
And
were really
it was just a terrible blow for the family, for Jenny, of course, but also for Karl.
So the central wager of the book, and this is where I want to connect to the concerns that I know that Clara wants to raise with you, is this idea that by way of so we can kind of put a bracket around the 20th century, and we're in this space now where we can close out the 20th century, which is so troublesome for people thinking about Marx and with Marx, and we can make this sort of leap from the 21st century back to the 19th century, and that this constitutes the actuality of the current moment. And this, I guess, is where I know that Clara wants to come in with a series of questions and provocations about the issue really that has to concern us all. Like, why read Marx? Why read Marx now? What is it that should be on our minds? Clara, do you want to take it from there?
Sure. Thank you for having me here, and I really appreciated reading the book. Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay, so yes, I would like to try to enlarge this conversation to, I think, some preoccupations and thoughts, as Adam said, that are in all of our minds. And in fact, they are foremost in the minds of the author, who in the introduction writes, "Nostalgia is not an emotion suitable for Marx studies. We need him for the present and for the future." Now, I think what is interesting is that this intuition is not at all just an intuition of scholars writing of Marx, such as Sven-Eric. It's now an intuition that is appearing ever more in the mainstream media. And if you actually were reading some articles in these days for the bicentenary of Marx's birth, we see that there were many articles. For example, in the New York Times, one was actually called "Happy Birthday, Karl Marx, You Were Right." And even, the governor of the Central Bank of England has made references to wage stagnation and unemployment as potential triggers for communism, referring directly to Marx. So the point is that Marx is an author that cannot anymore be ignored. And I think what is interesting for us today is to develop a little bit of why this is the case. And so Marx, a thinker alive today. And I think, first of all, it is one of the obvious answers is that things that appear visible to us as members of this society daily, that I don't think, I'll mention briefly, but I'm sure you guys are all aware of the fact, for example, that Oxfam says that 82% of global wealth generated in 2017 went to the top 1%. Or the fact that there are 8 people in this world owning more than half of the world population. So this inequality as actually not an exception to the norm of capitalism, but as the result of the very functioning of capitalist accumulation. And this is the case also for structural unemployment. The reserve army of labor, a problem that clearly preoccupies all of us. It was very funny, I was listening to the news the other day in Italy. I'm obviously always interested in seeing what's going on in Italy, and the news was optimistically saying that youth unemployment has reached only 32% now. So, these are the type of preoccupations we all have, and of course, Marx very well saw that centralization and of course the concentration of power in the hands of giant corporations that have more capital to invest in technological unemployment, of course, is accelerating the phenomenon of automation and technological unemployment, such as even the PwC, the global consulting firm, has said that by 2030, probably 35% or more of the jobs that are out there will be taken over by machines. So clearly these are all aspects that what is interesting enough is that the mainstream economic theory, including a lot of so-called heterodox theories, are not capable of explaining. So why is Marx an author that cannot be ignored? Well, because Marx actually understood these phenomena very well as being actually forms of existence of capital. And why was he able to explain this? Well, why was someone, again, writing in the 19th century so illuminated to even predict what is going on today? Well, the reason is very simple. The reason is that Marx was talking about the core of the system that we're still in today and that we actually see striving at its utmost rootlessness. And this core is capital, and capital is a social relation. So Marx understood that these phenomena are all the outcome of capital as a social relation of a very specific kind, which is the relation between capital and labor. And this relation is not a universal eternal relation, but it is actually historically specific and coming about in a specific moment of human history after the so-called primitive accumulation and thus the appropriation of resources in the hands of few, and in this way the creation of two classes fundamentally, the classes of the owners of the means of production who control and appropriate the surplus, and the class of the producers of the means of production, the working class. And today, you know, the majority of us are actually wage workers. So it's not something that it's just in Marx's writings. It's something that is profoundly characterizing capitalism. Capital is a social relation, and it is still this social relation that is alive now. So this is fundamentally a revolutionary intuition of Marx. Why? Well, because he was opposing the bourgeois political economy of his time, which, unfortunately, I would say, is still the dominant framework today, which was not capable of seeing the social relation because it was eternalizing economic categories and seeing capital actually as a non-problem, as a natural fact that should just be accepted. And this is why I think one of the other reasons Marx is such a profoundly important author for us today is that Marx was very attentive as a critique of approaches to knowledge, a critique of knowledge. So one of the cliches about Marx being a determinist, Marx being someone who didn't care about ideas, well, actually, Marx was one of the most insightful authors in realizing how much it is ideas that are profoundly intertwined with the material conditions, and this is something that Sven-Eric describes quite well, I think, in the book, and how this dialectical relation between ideas and material conditions is fundamental to understand why certain ideas are so powerful in maintaining capital as a social structure alive. Why is capital, that is a historical relation, and thus, by definition, prone to change, right? Something that could change. Why is it not mutating? Why? Well, one of the reasons is that the type of hegemonic ideas that circulate eternalize capital. And actually, more than that, more than just eternalizing capital, what happens is that thought is in a reified form. And what does this mean? It means that we perceive the world out there, economic facts, economic laws, as separated from us and having an existence of their own. So ontologies independently from human relations that thus can only be understood by experts, and our behavior should adapt to, right? Adapt to these economic laws instead of understanding these economic laws, as Marx well told us, are the result of our social relations of production and exchange, and thus are something profoundly changeable by us ourselves. So in this criticism to reified thought, Marx is proposing a very clear alternative. And what is this alternative? Well, this is an alternative that sees knowledge not as a means to perpetuate the status quo, but knowledge as a power, a weapon, in the hands of the subaltern classes, in the hands actually of the majority who is not in possession of the means of production. and a weapon which is emancipatory. So knowledge as a possibility to realize what are the social relations that we are part of and we contribute in shaping by seeing the world as static, by adopting a passive outlook towards the world because we are convinced that the world is the way it is and in a way is not changeable, so we become all passive. Well, Marx is saying exactly the opposite. We can become empowered by ideas because ideas are what can actually constitute a revolutionary source. And in this, I would like to conclude with just a very brief comment about how this is also important, again, Marxian intuitions, which have been very well, I think, expounded by what Sven-Eric in the book calls the deviationists. So the deviationists, authors such as Gramsci, Lukács, and many others, really saw. What did I want to say? Yes, really saw how Marxian knowledge is a knowledge that is opposing dramatically an understanding of expert knowledge, technocratic, top-bottom understanding of the relation between intellectuals and society. Right? And this emancipatory knowledge has to be necessarily a knowledge that is, in fact, diffused, comes from the bottom, is shared, is a collective activity. This is why, in my view, Marx would consider Keynesian analysis, which is actually very much focused about expert knowledge. Keynes himself, and Keynesians after him even worse, really thought that you could divide the economic from the political. Make the economic the sphere of experts, depoliticize the economic, but the economic is actually what we are all involved with. It's the fact that our wages are too low to actually get at the end of the month. It's the fact that we are struggling for survival. All this, according to the Keynesian experts, is something that should be left in the hands of few. And of course, in Gramsci's analysis, this is well expanded. The idea is exactly the opposite. The idea is that there should be a dialectical, Gramsci talks about the democratic philosopher. There should be a dialectical understanding of the relationship between the organic intellectual and people. And people should use knowledge to empower and to move on and change capital as a social relation. And this is also, I think, well exemplified also by Marx himself, who never, as again Sven-Eric makes very clear, was not an author that had an ambition to be the leader of the revolution. He wrote books because he believed in ideas, right? So he was not a deterministic. He wrote this book because he thought that his book could be a guide for revolution that was coming from below. And I think this is a very important point that unfortunately much of the academia today loses sight of, and especially economists have the tendency to appropriate knowledge in a very, very authoritarian way. Okay, and so I think these are just some thoughts, but of course there's much more to be said about why Marx is an author who is alive and talking to us today. So maybe we could hear a few words from the author and then open up, or I think Adam had a few other questions. Yeah.
Oh, yes, thank you very much, Clara. It was great to listen to you. I'm so happy as an old man that a young generation now is coming. And I have been in this field, as I told Adam before, more than 50 years. I translated Marx's early writings, some of them, the manuscripts and Introduction to German Ideology and others, in 1965, many, many years ago. This was just a period when Marx there was a new interest in Marx, but those writings, most of all, I think, because they were oppositional to the orthodox dogmatic Soviet school. It started most of all in Poland and in Czechoslovakia, to some small extent even in the Soviet Union, a younger generation who saw that there was another Marx, much more interesting than a system builder. Yes, something is changing. And I think also that the reason why it's so easy to see Marx's importance today is very much that in the last 3 decades, maybe since 1980 or something like that, we have had a radical change. It's normally called neoliberalism and so. The period starts maybe with Margaret Thatcher's and Ronald Reagan's coming to power around 1980. By this, the old world that was self-evident to me, to all of my generation, with the Soviet bloc and the United States and its allies and some countries in between, that something was radically changing. The French economist Thomas Piketty, he's talking about the conservative Anglo-Saxon revolution around 1980. I think that's very, very good. It was really a revolution in many respects. But that means that Marx is so clearly back now. In another way, the Soviet orthodoxy, we have almost nothing of that left today. But something new is coming. And I think this is very, very... I think I'm really optimistic about the future of Marx. I think Marx has so much to tell us today. The normal left-wing, not Marxist critique of capitalism is that the capitalists, they are so greedy. They have some terrible greediness. But of course, Marx, he understood that this personal property greediness, it's Marx, he had in Capital a very important concept, namely character mask, that to be a capitalist you must really struggle for your profit in your struggle with the labor class. You have to, if not, you are lost. You can be, I have a quotation from Marx, I hope I have it here somewhere. Yes, Marx, he dramatizes the text, he puts himself in the worker's place and says to the capitalist, quotation, "You may be a model citizen, perhaps a member of society for the prevention of cruelty to animals, and in the order of a sanctity to boot. But the thing that you represent face to face with me has no heart in its breast." I think it's exactly what is happening today.
So it's an impersonal quality.
Capitalism, not the singular capitalists, but it is a system, a relation between capital and labor.
Can I want to pick up on something that Clara was pointing to in her fascinating intervention, and then this question of the actuality of the 21st century and how Marx relates to that. And then, as Clara was saying, I think we'll ask for a round of questions from the floor. It may sound like a kind of trivial point, but I think it arises directly out of the problem of biography and doing the problem of biography. And it's something one can feel you struggling with in the text, which is how far does Marx succumb to the temptation of expertise himself? Because though structurally, I think we would all want to agree with Clara's account of Marxism and Marxist theory as a weapon of the critique of ideology, and of bourgeois ideology in particular, and its manifestation as a kind of expertise. As you lay out in the biography, he struggles to be tolerant. He struggles to be tolerant of two different dimensions. One is horizontal, if you like, which exposes around the young Hegelians, in other words, peer-to-peer, PhD philosophy to PhD philosophy, are you reading Hegel right? And then there are other moments in his encounters with the working class movement where he's in fact, it's the haut en bas, it's a vertical critique of we, those who have knowledge, against those who are autodidacts, who really don't know. And particularly in his letters with Engels, where the two of them are just letting off steam, one sees an aspect of personality which is intolerant of those who are uneducated, and a critique of Philistinism, which is clearly crucial to any kind of radical politics, which cannot accept common sense as a norm, given its idealness, is a classic Gramscian point, spills over into a form of arrogance, essentially, of the educated in relation to... And one feels this in your... And this is a problem posed by the biographical question. This may be irrelevant to Marxism or the project of critical theory, but in the person of Marx, this is a live problem.
Oh, yes, you're right, absolutely. Marx, he was a very temperamental person. Furious
angry,
sometimes.
Furious, right?
Sometimes. He was really politically active, most of all in the late 1840s, in connection with the revolution, the revolutions around Europe, 1848 to 49 or even 50. And then with the international, what we now call the First International, in both periods, Marx started, as a man open to compromises, trying to keep together those different forces there. He had his own very definite standpoint, but he tried to find some way to make compromises. Also with the liberals in the 1848. But then, when he didn't succeed, he became just furious and struggled against everybody, I can say. And the same pattern you can see in the International. At first, Marx was very, very... he was reluctant to join the International, but then coming in, he was so enormously ambitious in this field, writing the address, very important document, and he tried to find some unity between the different, the Blanquists, the Proudhonists, and his own followers. But then it was as soon as Bakunin, the anarchist, became influential in the International, then there's a definite clash between Marx and Bakunin, and then he was exactly that, furious and absolutely intolerant.
Punitive. I mean, they're
exactly.
destructive exercises.
And of course, he was such a person that was very sure that he was right. Yes. He was convinced that he had found some kind of definite solution to some problems. So you can say that there are some traits in Marx's work, in his writing, in his acting, that are close to what some of his followers in the 19th century dramatized in a terrible way, more and more terrible way.
So the bigger question I have, and it'll be the final one I put before we open it up, is really about this optimism. It may be simply that I'm the middle-aged person on the panel between Clara and yourself, but I worry that we can't make this move, that this move from the 19th century to the 21st century misses dynamics that should make us much, much more pessimistic, and which mean that the critique of, as Clara was so vividly describing it, of the core dynamic of capital, which manifests itself in the 1850s for the first time, and then, as you're saying, sort of the trimmings are stripped away from the 1980s, and now it's nakedly revealed again. And that provides the bridge, and that provides then this sense also of kind of revolutionary actuality. And so then we can cut the 20th century out. And I'm just not persuaded that that describes our current situation. And I just want to point to three, kind of factors which really muddy the waters and I think put us in a rather different condition structurally. The first and the most obvious is climate change. If that is real, that changes the horizon of expectation for humanity, and the logic which is not visible in the 19th century, or indeed even for most of the 20th century, of an urgent environmental envelope changes the game. Part of the reason why that envelope is as pressing as it is the utterly spectacular, totally unprecedented quality of development under state capitalism in China since the late 1980s. That is the industrial, this is, everything that happened in the 19th century pales totally by comparison, right? In the last 15, I'm sorry, I'm making hand movements like Trump. I'll put these hands, like, in the last 20 years, the Chinese, and it's a Trumpy point I'm going to make, in the last 20 years, the Chinese have doubled total steel capacity in the world. The entire history of heavy industry up to 2000, everyone's doubled since 2000 in one country under one regime, right? And that is a legacy of the 20th century. Indeed, it's a legacy of Marxism in the 20th century in one particular form that did not end in 1989, and in an incredibly ambiguous way is now stamping its footprint on the world, transforming the conditions, and forcing us, if you add India into the equation and the rest of Asia, up against that environmental envelope in a way that no one's ever experienced before. And all of this takes place under a third sign, which again is classically 20th century, for which the 19th century knows no equivalent, which is the hyperpower of the United States and its military force. This is not even Lenin's imperialism. This is something far more dramatic in its consequences. And so those three factors, these sort of huge hangovers from the late 20th century, the last 30 years into the 21st century, mean that I'm just less persuaded of this ellipse that allows us to get from the 1850s to 2018, right? And then it's all good. You see what I'm getting at? And to me, then, the question is, so how does one respond in a Marxist spirit? Presumably, Marx, the radicalism of the Marx of the 1840s and 50s is he's facing novelty, and he's theorizing radical novelty. And it seems to me that to that extent, the sort of neoclassicism of going back to the 1850s may in some sense be betraying the project, which should be to embrace radical novelty as the problem. Like, well, how do we theorize, how do we think critically about this threefold extreme condition? Which is historically, it seems reasonable to say it's historically unprecedented.
Yes, of course you are right. I mean, putting the 20th century into brackets, I'm just saying that I think in order to understand Marx himself, you have to do that. Yeah. In order to come close to him, to his life, and most of all to his thought. I think you must put those brackets around the 20th century. But of course, I myself, I'm really a product of the 20th century, very much so. But the three points you made here, of course, they are very, very important. First, the climate change. There's an American Marxist thinker, John Bellamy Foster. He has published a book, I think, a very important book on Marxist ecology. It was 18 years ago. he is absolutely right. You can find in Marx especially in Capital, somewhere else too, some short remarks about how dangerous capitalism has proved to be for environment. But of course, Marx had absolutely no idea of the dimensions that we are facing today, the climate problem, mankind, by its production, is able to change the climate, maybe a catastrophic way. I have some optimism. I have several friends and acquaintances among technologists who are relatively optimistic, seeing what is happening now, especially with solar energy. Also in China.
Yeah,
particularly in China. It's interesting that China has also that phase. I mean, the solar energy phase, not only coal and oil and all that, but also that. But of course, it's a terrible, difficult, extremely threatening question, this about climate change. And here, of course, it's a catastrophe that this country has a president that denies all those things, and it's just weather. It's weather. It's not climate, change. China, yes, of course. There is not much left of Marxism in China today. There are people, some very interesting people, trying to reintroduce Marxism in the thought of or in the middle of Chinese politics, but they are not very successful. China is most of all a very efficient capitalist society, capitalist economy. China is a problem, and of course the military force of the United States too. I think I don't remember exactly the percentage of the American armed forces. It's more than 50% of the world's.
World's spending.
Yeah.
Well, it was until recently.
Yeah. So those are that is really severe problems here. But I think something that Gramsci has said that I often quote, I think it's very important, that you have to be pessimistic in your thinking, but optimistic.
The will.
Yeah. I think it is very good to be an optimist. Well, if you, in your actions, you must be optimistic, convinced that you can change something. Otherwise, you can just capitulate for all those terrible things that are happening today and are such terrible challenges to us all.
Clara, do you want to come back?
Yeah, maybe a couple of words before passing over to the audience that I'm sure will contribute well to our discussion. I don't know if I would use the word, I don't know if ellipse is the right word, because it seemed to me, yes, of course, the structural conditions.
Ellipse, but
ellipse,
to contain
exactly.
the 20th century.
The ellipse, I mean, the thing is that if we're trying to discuss how Marx's writings and ideas are important today, I don't think it is a matter of course, Marx was seeing capitalism at his time, yet as I first briefly said, capital, the hard core, the social relation is still well alive today and actually is capable of explaining exploitation, and wage labor explains many of the contradictions of the system we see today. And in this sense, I think what is, I think, something that is very valuable for Marx, to look at Marx, is actually Marxism as a method, right? What Lukács wrote, what is Orthodox Marxism? And if you adopt Marxism as Marxism thought as a method, then you realize many things. You can interpret many things of today's world and of the history of the 20th century, right? So it is a lens to look at the history of the 20th century also in a critical way, something that I think is missing many times when there is this idealization, for example, of the golden age of capitalism, idealization of market socialism. Well, if you look at Marx, for Marx, market socialism is a contradiction in terms. Market socialism has nothing to do with his idea of emancipation, of liberation. It is actually a way to just act upon the sphere of distribution and not in the sphere of production. That is really where you find the source of all the contradiction of capital as a social relation of production. So a possible alternative to capitalism isn't the forms of adulterated capitalism we saw in the 20th century, especially also because it was, of course, in response. The human face of capitalism emerged, of course, as a response to the threat of Soviet Russia in many ways, economic, ideological threat. And so to be critical of positions that I think are very widespread today, of many people who think that what will solve the contradictions is merely to, increase wages or reform capitalism in the distribution sphere. Well, a Marxian method would tell you, no, you have to look deeper. Economic categories are actually the outcome of the core, the social relation. And this is something that I think still today is extremely valid and actually gives us a lens to be critical about the progressive left that dominates in many circles, and I would say, right? And in a way can be useful to see how revolution is not even an event, is an ontological state of continuous change of which we have to be part of if we want things to change. It's not going to be Marx or anyone for Marx telling you how to make a revolution or telling you, yes, we delivered you with the change, with experts saying, no, it's us all contributing daily to ontological changes of who we are, what we think, and what we do. And this, I think, is optimism, which is not, I think, in any way anachronistic, and is actually something that is, to me, the only hope that, the passivity I was discussing, how, a reified thought brings about a passive attitude, which we all share. There's many people who say we're such an impassive attitude that people think it's much more easy, it's going to be easier that the world will collapse rather than capitalism will disappear, right? So the point is that we really need to get out of this mood of just thinking, okay, this is it. This is the immutable eternal structure, and this is all we can get out of it. No, we can make changes. I think things like the ecological crisis are actually, triggers to say either we act fast or, again, we'll just destroy ourselves, right? So I think in this, there's a lot to learn from this book and from reading Marx directly, this book is very special because it takes on not just the life, but the works, and I really suggest that reading Marx is an amazing experience that can tell us a lot about what's going on in our lives, unfortunately, almost, I would say. So should we open the floor? So,
yeah, let's have a couple of contributions from the floor if there are voices out there. Yeah, guy here. By all means, stick your hands up and we'll make a kind of cue. Person at the back there. Excellent, I got you there.
Hi. Does it? Yes, it does. So I wanted to thank Clara for the many excellent points that she made. And I wanted to contribute a bit about my reading of Marx, where it's not only an analysis or a critique, but it's a call to arms. It's a call to arms against a system and the systematic and the social relation that he finds not only problematic but doomed by definition, things we should get over with. And to be honest, I disagree a bit that these three super factors that you counted on pose substantial challenges to a Marxist critique or a Marxist call to arms. Marx deals with the environmental catastrophe. He deals with the mindset of capitalists behind me, the flood, and their inability to uphold an environment in which capital can survive. He deals with an imperialist superpower of his time, which is not the US, but England, which exercises a very similar power than the US does today. And honestly, your point about China was that there's a second industrial revolution. Well, Marx sees one industrial revolution, and he still thinks we can win. Not although of the industrial revolution, but because of the industrial revolution, because of the productive power of capitalism, the workers can take over. And so that's my reading of Marx, a call to arms to take power into the hands of the working class.
Excellent. We've got a person at the back here, maybe on the sofa. If you can make yourself visible.
So this is kind of a multi-level question, but we obviously see like a disturbing trend in like China, Russia, Nicaragua, where people that are revolutionaries become these kleptocrats that are just fascists for many reasons. So I kind of want to know why you think that is. Like, is it more than greed that like people that were once committed to the revolution, calling themselves communists, become the richest people in the world and become authoritarian in a very, very fascist way? And I'm sure you know what's going on in Nicaragua right now, so I would love to hear your thoughts on how we could do anything with what's going on now.
Do we have another contribution to add? Yes. We need to bring the mic all the way around, sorry. Just slow down a sec, we need the mic because of the live stream.
I'd like to try to ask a series of briefly stated questions. One is, but first an observation. The future is open. We don't know, and we cannot know tomorrow. We can have maps, they'll be imperfect. So that's the way that is. But first, isn't the post-capitalist society going to be the post-labor society? It'll be the society which is no longer the laboring society. Everyone gets up in the morning, goes to work all day, and then comes home, and especially if they're the wife or whatever, they do housework all evening and blah, 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 and everybody is the precariat who's just struggling to survive. I don't know how we get there, but I mean, one question is revolution. What is the role of the conquest of state power now, today, tomorrow, in revolution? Especially considering the fact that if there were a Paris Commune tomorrow and 2 million people marched in the streets of New York, they might just kill us all. Think about it. They have the weapons to do so. They could evacuate New York and go live in bunkers in Geneva. Who cares? We do. Finally, what is the relationship of socialism or communism, hopefully not communism, I'll make it quick, to management and the managed society? We actually have a professional class, and they manage the whole society, just like in the Soviet Union. I think the key, I'll end here, but first, there's the old idea of democratic self-management, and I think that is dead. And secondly, we increasingly have, I'll just end with this, we now spend more money on prisons in this country than education, but the prison system is being rivaled by something else. It's the mental health system. Everybody's on drugs. Everybody's crazy. And everybody has to be managed because everybody's dangerous and scared. What do we do about that?
Thank you. Sven-Eric, do you want to take your pick? Don't feel this is a pick and mix.
Yeah. There are several questions here. Of course, this about environmental questions. Of course, Marx, he was very well aware about the dangers here. He's using the concept unheilbar risk, it's incurable rift between man and nature. That's the effect of capitalism. So I think there is really something there to go on with there. But most of all, of course, in this context, Marx is important with his encompassing theory about capitalist society, the whole system. So this is one of the consequences of capitalism, but not the one that Marx himself is so extremely well aware of it. He was it, but not that much. Then we have the question about what's going on now. I think the other day I read an article by David Runciman in Wall Street Journal. He was talking about the authoritarian pragmatism that is so strong today. I think it's a very, very good description of what's going on with not only with Trump but with Putin and Erdogan and many, many others. Authoritarian pragmatism. I mean that for example, the president of this country today is really very exemplary in this way, that he is an authoritarian pragmatist. Yes, then the third question, maybe better you answer to it, I think.
I mean, the question I took to be most directly addressed to me came from the friend over here, who I think, perhaps I wasn't expressing myself clearly enough, but I think there's a misunderstanding of what I was trying to say, which is that Sven-Eric's book makes this claim that the connection, and the bit that you read out made this very clear, right? That the Marx that speaks of the 21st century is the Marx of the 19th century. Mm-hmm. And there is this sense in which, therefore, we can build this relationship to the essentially simpler world of the mid-19th century, first phase of capitalism. Mm. And that speaks to us now as a result of, as it were, the purification of our current situation, the second phase of globalization, the neoliberal revolution of the 80s and so on. And my point was simply, was precisely to call for instead a Marxist account of our current situation, which I take along those three axes to be qualitatively different from that of the mid-19th century. I don't think one can agree with you that imperial power, the British imperial power in the mid-19th century, compares in any very obvious way with that of America today. The Chinese state capitalist model of growth is unprecedented at its scale and dwarfs the first phase of industrial revolution by a factor of about 5 in terms of its annual growth rate. So the point is simply that that does indeed call out not for a reprise of a 19th century analysis, but of an application of a Marxian analytic in the present. So in that sense, I think we agree with each other that that is indeed the urgent task. On this question of regime degeneration, I mean, I think that's always quite interesting, and it's important, I think, to make a dividing line round about 1989. I mean, as much as a critique of corruption was one of the weapons within which, during the Cold War, the West would beat Soviet-style regimes, the idea of corruption in East Germany consisted of privileges such as being chauffeured around in a Volvo estate to a hunting lodge that looked like something out of the Catskills from about the 1950s. Our notion of corruption now in the post-communist era, shorn of the disciplines of the Soviet-era parties, is radically different from what it was then. Degenerate as those regimes undoubtedly were. And I do think this is one of the crucial questions that's being played out in China right now. How does that logic of corruption, of oligarchic, spectacular affluence, how does it interact with a one-party regime of the Chinese type? And the party is obviously acutely sensitive on precisely this issue. So I think that's a game in motion that it will be very interesting to see played out. But I think historically one has to draw the line at 89. As bad even as the Ceausescu regime was, it's got nothing on Western kleptocracy. Let's have another, let's see whether there's more questions in the room for Sven-Eric, perhaps, that we could address. Yes, Anderson. We need a mic.
So, thank you. Just a very quick, quick question. Going deep into Marxism, you must have spent a very long time. I mean, you've spent all your life looking at his work and so on, and thinking about him in the really long term. What do you see as his major lacunae? What is it that Marx is obviously missing, and how does that relate to the current moment? Adam mentioned a few a bias against reproductive labor. One can think of the failure to grasp the ecological impact of global capitalism along the same lines as a failure to grasp with the reproductive labor of ecology and not just women and so on. But these are just these have been covered. What else? Do you see the appreciative aspect of that Marx assigns, the role that Marx assigns to capital as being the driver of innovation as problematic? Is capitalism not appropriating the innovation of other communities that are not driven by profit?
Yes, it's a good question. Of course, Marx, he was a 19th century man, just as Jonathan Sperber says. Of course, he had his limits that were very important in his time there. But this is self-evident, must be so. But what is typical of Marx is, I think, that he hadn't a real sense of the irrational in man. The irrational in man. I think there is some kind of a limit of blindness. He had his own irrationality, as we all have, but he couldn't see that. I think I'm very interested in those people in the 20th century that were interested to create some kind of a Freudo-Marxism. Mm-hmm. I mean, this is another aspect of mankind that you have in Freud. I think this is very fruitful. I must add that I am myself now completing a short book together, a psychoanalyst, a specialist in this field, out in Swedish in half a year, I think. So I have some ideas there that there was a blindness in Marx in exactly here in this point, and I think his shortcomings here had something to do with that.
So I sense elevator by elevator that the mood in the room is shifting, and we're moving into a festive birthday mode. But perversely, that prompts me to ask one last question, and I think Sebastian Budgeon would also appreciate me asking this question and to hear you expounding on this issue. Sebastian, I gather, being the editor who commissioned this for Verso, and I know that one of the things that he's interested in, and that one of the things that really struck me, and you alluded to it at the beginning, was the way in which the Sperber, the Gareth Stedman-Jones books simply are not dealing with what in German is called a neue Marx-Lektüre, so the new reading of Marx. And I know that for Verso and for many of your English-speaking readers, this is going to be one of the significant contributions that this book makes, is opening up for an Anglophone readership the significance of this new German discussion about Marx, which has bubbled up over the last couple of decades, is centered in Berlin around figures like Haug and Heinrich that you alluded to. And perhaps just as a concluding comment, you could give us, your take on why this debate is so important, and why this needs to be fully integrated into a biography such as this.
I think the reason is most of all that we have had, and in the Anglo-Saxon countries still is dominant, an idea of Marx still as the capital as a system, a closed system. You have the productive forces, you have the relations of production, and they are interacting in some way. What those people have done is to opening up, most of all, the third volume of Capital. if I'm right, there's a discussion going on here in the United States between David Harvey and Andrew Kleeman exactly on this point. And I think what has been so important in this Neue Marx-Lektüre is opening up this aspect where also the relations of production are becoming much more important and central in Marx's work. And you can see that Engels' edition of Marx's manuscript, the result of which was the third volume of Capital, this edition made this point in Marx difficult to discern, I think. Engels wanted to close the system. The theory, close the system, but Marx was always open-minded. To me, that is exactly what especially Michael Heinrich has stressed, that Marx in the last years of his life, at Stedman Jones and Spurbus here, he was doing just nothing. He was old and tired. But there, Marx, he had an idea to opening up the fourth volume of Capital in something new, something fundamentally new. And there, I think this is the most important thing here, that Marx's system isn't a system, it's open. Yes. It's open, and we have to go on. I think that's the point that Clara has made here very clearly, that we have to go on, to go further on, as Gramsci did, but now we are in a historically new situation. There we have a possibility to go on.
And I'm sure that this will just be the beginning of further discussions of your book too, but for this evening, I think you should all join me in thanking Sven-Eric for a fascinating discussion.